Well, good morning to you all and a very warm welcome to the Deloitte Academy. My name is William Touche and I will be your host for this morning's session. It's my great pleasure once again to welcome Howard Covington back to the Deloitte Academy to share his view of the future. This year, his talk is entitled Life in the Early Anthropocene. During his career, Howard has been a director of investment bank S.G. Warburg, European Chief Executive of US investment bank Wasserstein Perella, a founder and Chief Executive of New Star Asset Management, a trustee of the Science Museum in London, chair of the Isaac Newton Institute for Mathematical Sciences at Cambridge University, the founding chair of the Alan Turing Institute, the UK's Research Institute for Big Data and AI, chair of the public interest environmental law firm Client Earth, and chair of the Scotia Group, a group of internationalists supporting the climate COP process. Howard has degrees in theoretical physics and applied maths from Cambridge University and is a fellow of the UK's Institute of Physics. Now, Howard will speak for about 40 minutes and then answer our questions. Please post these in the Q&A function as usual. I do hope you're sitting comfortably, as Howard is certainly a tour de force, and he will challenge us with his remarks today. Howard, we've been looking forward to this very much. Over to you.
William, thank you very much, and good morning, everybody. It's a great pleasure to be with you. So I'm going to talk to you about life in the early Anthropocene. And as the footnote says, the Anthropocene is a new geological epoch. It's defined by the significant human impact on the planet's geology and its ecosystems. This is an unofficial new epoch because the geologists can't make up their minds when it began. I think it began around 1950. Now, I'm going to talk to you a bit about geology, but before I do, let me talk to you about two of the principal actors in the early Anthropocene. And these are AI algorithms and China. The table in the sort of orangey pink on the left is a potted history of AI. So it begins with the period 1980 to 2010, where the platforms for AI, the PCs, the internet and the iPhone were invented and became widespread. And this led to a huge amount of data being available that algorithms could work on. And lo and behold, in 2012, the first major commercially available application of AI became available. This is pattern recognition. It comes in the force of face recognition and also in the ability to distinguish words in spoken language, so language recognition. This has been a great success, and things continued. And in about 2016, the AI community and the Go playing community were shocked when DeepMind's AlphaGo algorithm defeated one of the world's champions at the game of Go. The thing that was shocking about this to the AI community was that this kind of algorithm that could do this wasn't expected for at least another decade, but here it was. The thing that was shocking to the Go community was the way that AlphaGo played. It played with what, if it were human, would be called great originality and great insight. This was quite a shocking moment. The next algorithms in that table, starting with BERT and going down to WuDao 2, are natural language processing algorithms. And I've put them here because these are developing at a very rapid rate. And you can see the rate of development if you look at the table, if you look at the column-headed parameters. So these have gone from 350 million with BERT up to 1.7 trillion now. What these algorithms do is they teach themselves to forecast the end of a sentence from the beginning of a sentence, and to isolate the key words in a sentence. The way they teach themselves to do this is they read the whole of Wikipedia and other databases, and they adjust their parameters until they get these predictions right. Because they can isolate keywords and predict how sentences will end, they can do what, if they were human, we would call tracing through meaning. They can identify meaning in blocks of text. So you can ask these algorithms, if you want to write an 800-page essay on why Boris Johnson should resign or why Boris Johnson shouldn't resign. In either case, they will give you a very well-argued and well-structured essay. If you want to, you can converse with them. Of course, you can trip them up. They're certainly not human level conversationalists, but they are pretty good. The one at the bottom of the table, Wu Dao 2, can converse in Mandarin and in English, and can write poetry in both languages. I put at the bottom of the table the number of synapses in the human cortex for comparison. The parameters are increased. The parameters in these programs are increasing at something like 10 times per year. So they'll have some, in some sense, the complexity of the human cortex within a few years. Where is all this headed? Well, one of the things that has got a great deal of publicity lately is the metaverse. In the metaverse, you will be represented by an avatar, or in a more sophisticated version, a hologram, and your avatar will talk to other avatars. Almost certainly behind some of the avatars or holograms, there will not be humans. There will be natural language processing algorithms, and you will be able to interact directly with them. One application of the metaverse will be an environment where AI can interview humans directly. It's kind of interesting. Now, the other principal actor in the early Anthropocene is China. The green block there illustrates China's tech journey over the last 10 years. Let me just run through it quickly. Tencent produced the WeChat super app in 2011, which enabled the Chinese people to transact just about everything they wanted to on the web through one app. Xi became president, and that coincided with a massive extension of China's surveillance program from cities into the countryside. There are now something like 1 billion surveillance cameras in China. 2014, the social credit plan was launched. Algorithms monitor behavior online and in the physical world, and give people social credit points according to how well they behave. Then the services they can use if their social credit score is high enough. 2015, a biometric database project was launched to record voice prints and fingerprints and so on for all of China's inhabitants. 2015, the program began to make sure China could make every important industrial good by itself by 2025. 2015 was interesting. China flipped from a cash economy to a mobile payments economy using QR codes. I've put a picture there, top right, of a very happy beggar begging with a QR code. This works because the transaction charge is 0 on all but the largest transactions. Then 2016, DeepMind's AlphaGo. This was an epiphany for China. They suddenly realized what AI algorithms could do, and a year later produced the national plan for China to lead the world in AI by 2030. 2020, the digital renminbi was piloted. The digital renminbi has two important functions. It will establish the renminbi as an international currency, but also it will allow the central bank, China's central bank, to monitor individuals' transactions right throughout the economy. 2021, cryptocurrency was banned in China. There can only be one authority that can monitor transactions, and the leveling up program was announced. One aspect of this is taking down the tech entrepreneurs who have got too big for their boots in the perspective of the Communist Party. You can't have rival centers of power in China, nor can you have rival centers of mass data processing. China's been busy developing other technologies as well, apart from digital ones. Hypersonic missiles were in the news last year, and the build-up of China's nuclear missile capability. It's also the world's leader in 2 or 3 of the sectors of quantum technology, and there is Wudao 2. China takes leadership, if only for a moment, in the scale of natural language processing algorithms. And I've put at the bottom, China's zero COVID policy continues, just to make the point that I think what we're seeing here is China's recognition of its own exceptionalism. It has done remarkable things in the last decade. And I think looking around the world, it considers itself the exceptional power. The second picture on the right, there are a couple of police officers. They're not wearing sunglasses, they're wearing face recognition glasses. On their handheld devices, they see the records of the person they are looking at. Better to police the streets. Now let's do some geology quickly. In case it isn't evident, let me tell you, a geological transition is underway. Let me run through what's going on, starting at 12 o'clock there with the atmosphere. So the atmosphere is warming at about 1/4 degree centigrade per decade. That is exactly what scientists have been forecasting for the last 30 years. What they haven't been forecasting, and what has surprised them, is that the impacts, the big impacts, are coming quicker and they are bigger than expected. Forests, there used to be pre-industrialization, 6 million trees. There are now about 3 trillion trees. We're losing trees, forests at 2 to 4% per annum. Some of them are near tipping points. Forests contain a huge amount of biodiversity, so this is part of triggering biodiversity loss. And if you look at the biodiversity box, we are losing wild terrestrial animal biomass at somewhere between 10% and 20% per decade. Now, you can do the arithmetic on that. If you lose stuff at that rate, you end up with very little after just a few decades. The reasons we're doing this is set out in the box on the right in relation to insects. It's habitat destruction and fragmentation, urbanization, deforestation, agricultural conversion, nitrification, pesticides, climate change, introduced species, and light pollution. What we've actually succeeded in doing is creating an environment which is hostile to non-human life. And we're doing this on a planetary scale. It's a kind of interesting achievement. We're going to see in the next few decades tipping points coming at us. There's a cascade of tipping points, and I've listed a few there. The Gulf Stream, which carries heat from the equator up to the Arctic, is slowing down and could stop in the next few decades. If it stops, the weather patterns both down by the equator and up here in the north will be transformed. The Amazon has been reduced by about 20%, somewhere between a 20 and a 30% reduction. There's likely to be a tipping point where it flips from rainforest to much drier savanna. The Amazon rainforest creates the weather for Central South America, so Central South America's weather could well change as a consequence. The northern forests, the boreal forests, are drying out and they're being attacked. They're drying out and getting warmer. And because they're getting warmer, they're being attacked by wood-boring insects that aren't killed off by the cold. As a consequence, they're dying and igniting. There's a tipping point approaching where the boreal forests will become sources of carbon rather than sinks of carbon. Another source of carbon is the melting permafrost. Potentially large amounts of methane could start bubbling up from that. And then the last one on my list, which has been in the news recently, is the West Antarctic. There's a rather large floating ice sheet called the Thwaites ice sheet, which looks like it's cracking up. It's about 100 kilometers wide. and it's something like a cork in a bottle. If it cracks up and disappears, the Thwaites Glacier, which lies behind it, will increase its rate of flow into the Amundsen Sea. What that means for sea level is unknown, but there's 4 meters of sea level in the West Antarctic, potentially to be released over a few centuries. Farming, we are shedding topsoil at something like 10% per decade. Industrial farming will be a historical curiosity by the end of this century. Migration, humans like to live in a temperature niche of between 11 and 15 degrees average temperature throughout the year. Within 50 years' time, something like 10 to 30% of humanity, 1 billion to 3 billion people, will be outside of that niche and will be seeking air conditioners or to move elsewhere. Fertility, now human males are seeing their sperm counts decline by about 10% per decade. Human males produce a lot of sperm, so that isn't yet a problem, but there will come a tipping point in the second half century where human fertilization may become difficult. The reason for this is chemicals called endocrine disruptors, which leach out of plastics that are everywhere in the environment and interfere with fetal growth. Lastly, oceans. The top layer of the oceans, a layer about 1 or 2 meters deep, has warmed by 0.13 degrees centigrade per decade for the last 100 years, i.e. we've done a 1.3 degrees warming of the top meter or so of the oceans. I mean, that is, when you think about it, an absolutely remarkable achievement given the scale of the oceans. Their acidity, measured by the number of hydrogen ions, is increased by 10%. And those two things together, the warming and the acidity, are playing havoc with ocean wildlife. Sea level by 2100 forecast to rise somewhere between 0.5 meter and 2.5 meters. The range of the forecast is because of the uncertainty of what happens in the West Antarctic and in Greenland. 2.5 meters would be quite something to cope with. I've got a box over on the right just to give it some extra information on oceans. The oceans contain something like 80% of animal biomass, 30% of marine species spend some of their life cycle on corals, which are being destroyed by warming. We're creating dead zones, we're polluting the oceans with plastic, we're overfishing, and we're now thinking of mining the seabed. Again, we're creating in the oceans an environment which is becoming hostile to life. What all of this adds up to is a change in the Earth's geology, accompanied by a mass extinction. There have been several of these before. They happen probably once every 100 million years or something like that on this scale. It's something of a privilege to be around to see the Earth being changed like this. One of the consequences of a mass extinction is that new species step in to fill the gaps opened up. And to be just slightly provocative, I've put my suggestion of a new species over on the left. It is AI algorithms. I've represented it by a mean-looking robot, but I don't expect it to be robots. I expect it to be the algorithms themselves. And the reason I expect this as a candidate is because algorithms are increasingly monitoring and acting in social media, and they will be in the metaverse. They're controlling services and transactions. They will control drones, power grids, weapons supplies. As humanity weakens, it's not inconceivable that AI will strengthen. All of this adds up to quite an interesting outlook, and you might expect that taken together, global disruption is possible this century. So I thought I might try and guesstimate with you the chance of deep global disruption. So first of all, what do I mean by that? So I've put a picture on the right of Lake Toba in Sumatra. 75,000 years ago, Lake Toba was a supervolcano. It erupted and it spewed 3,000 cubic kilometers of ash and dust up into the air, and that darkened the sun and caused a volcanic winter. The temperatures fell by about 4 degrees centigrade for about a decade. And of course, that wreaked havoc with the wildlife and vegetation. You can imagine that if that happened now, something like half the world's output would probably halve, i.e. you would get something like 25% of global output for an event of that magnitude. And that is the kind of thing I have in mind when I think of deep global disruption, an event that would cause that kind of change. Now, people, as far as I can see, don't study the probabilities of deep global disruption, but they do study the risks, the existential risk of human development being severely curtailed. There are now institutes studying this around the place, and they try and estimate the risks. And I'm basing what I'm going to say to you on the risks that they estimate for human curtailment, or the existential risks. So the first one that they worry about is the risk of misaligned AI. And the risk they associate with that of misaligned AI causing enormous disruption is 1 in 10 per century. And what they mean by this is that if you had a big enough computer so that you could simulate the Earth and all its people and so on over the period of a century, and you ran that simulation 10 times, then in one of those simulations, AI would get so misaligned from what humans would like it to do that you have a massive disruption. Just moving around, I put climate change at the same kind of risk. So if you were simulating the planet, 1 in 10 times the degree of disruption, of social and economic disruption caused by climate change would cause deep disruption. Some events which are less risky but still quite risky are an engineered pandemic. This is the case of a terrorist or a nutcase taking a bug which is already around and then engineering it as can now easily be done in a garage, engineering it so that it is more lethal and more transmissible, and then releasing it so that it causes disruption on a much greater scale than the pandemic we've just gone through. Another one is nature destruction. Very hard to estimate the consequences of nature destruction. The value of the services produced by natural systems is estimated to be roughly the same as global output, and we are estimated to be reducing natural capital, the ability to produce those services, at something like 10% a decade. So again, it's not inconceivable that the destruction of nature itself would cause deep global disruption with the same kind of probability, 1 in 30 per century. Nuclear war, I've put in the same basket, 1 in 30 per century of causing deep global disruption. And then my final category, new tech. I mean, there will be an unbelievable number of new technologies coming out this century. The probability of one of them having unintended consequences that cause deep global disruption, again, put at 1 in 30. Now, you can ask yourself the following question. If all of those things I've just been talking about were independent of one another, what is the chance that at least one of them would cause deep global disruption this century? And the answer is it's a very simple sum to do. The total deep disruption risk this century is something like 1 in 4. Now, of course, you can argue with all of my estimates. You can double them or halve them or whatever you like, but you're going to come out with something that is that order of magnitude. This compares with the risk of a supervolcano of something like 1 in 1,000 per century. In other words, we humans have created an environment for ourselves which is much higher risk than we have ever experienced before. When Boris Johnson introduced COP26 at the end of last year, he said in a speech that if we don't sort out climate change, a decline in civilization is possible. If you associate deep global disruption with a decline in civilization, I would say he was speaking accurately. I think there's a 1 in 4 risk of a decline in civilization this century. Now, you might think that that would mean all the countries of the world would do everything they conceivably could do to avoid this geological transition that we're going through. And indeed, they have made some quite big efforts through the various COP processes that go on. But as you doubtless know, despite the efforts, emissions are still going up and nature is still being destroyed. And I want to use this this picture to try and explain why. So this is the world viewed from the Pacific Rim. On the right is America. That ellipse there contains 5% of humanity. America is deeply, deeply innovative, and I have put a string of some of its larger tech companies around it. And of course, they are just the tip of the iceberg. I mean, there is no end to the American innovation and creativity. America has got every resource that you could want. It's got huge, wide open spaces, and yet it has become deeply dysfunctional. It is threatening, I think, it's threatening to overturn its democracy. Certainly, that's what American commentators think, and possibly replace it with some kind of autocracy. America has withdrawn from its leadership of the world and can no longer be relied on to lead the process of emissions reductions, or indeed to implement the reductions it agrees to. It's a tragedy for the world. It will be an even greater tragedy if America does lose its democracy. Moving into the middle, there is China, which of course is a very thoroughgoing autocracy. China sits in a very complex environment. The blue circle there contains 50% of humanity. It contains countries which are responsible for something like 50% of carbon emissions, and which will produce something like 50% of global economic output by mid-century. China is also deeply creative, deeply innovative, and I've put in pink there some of the leading Chinese tech companies. Two things are evident from these companies. First of all, they are, at least measured by market value, smaller in size than their US counterparts, and that is partly because of Xi's campaign against the digital platforms in order to contain them and to shift the focus of investors away from social media tech companies towards more fundamental tech companies. And indeed, there are a number of fundamental tech companies on my diagram. There's Huawei producing digital networks, CATL, the world's leading producer of batteries for electric vehicles, BYD, the world's largest producer of electric vehicles by number, and LONGi, easily the world's largest solar panel maker. China has been very thoughtful in its diplomacy, and the sort of sandy-coloured countries there are participants in its Belt and Road Initiative. Moving over to the left of the diagram, there's the other great power bloc, the EU. The EU does fantastically well economically. It's pretty powerful politically, but of course it's very weak militarily. And it's also not nearly as innovative as China or the US. I've put 4 of of Europe's leading digital companies there. And you can see at a glance, A, there's not many of them, and B, they're not nearly the same scale as their Chinese or US peers. Sitting above China is, of course, Russia, the looming presence of Russia. Mr. Putin's main policy is to disrupt the West and try and establish a ring of autocracies to protect Russia from the malign influence of democracies around its borders. I've also put on this, I put two other things on this diagram. The first is a series of green arrows. I said that between 1 and 3 billion people may be wanting to move later on in the century, and this gives you an indication of where they might come from and go to. On the right, people from South and Central America will flow up into the US. The US is a big place, it can take lots of them, but if things get too tough in America, even bigger sitting above it is Canada, so that you can anticipate that flow of people. China is in a much tougher position. Climate change is going to hurt it quite badly, but it's got a very porous northeastern border. Plenty of Han Chinese live on the Siberian side of the border, and one can anticipate a flow of people up into Siberia if things get quite tough. And it's very interesting in this context that China and Russia are entering into some kind of strategic alignment. Then over on the left, there are a couple of arrows, one from the Middle East and one from Africa up into Europe. Europe is very vulnerable to migration. The Europeans have nowhere to go. There's no arrow for them to follow. So quite an interesting picture. The reason that COPs don't do more is because the big power blocks, America, China, and Europe, are all in different positions. They do some stuff, though, the COPs. And to finish this diagram, there are some starbursts that you can see in Australia and up to the left in the Middle East. These are hydrogen projects to manufacture hydrogen from renewables. And that brings me on to the great success story of dealing with the geological transition, and that is clean tech. In my view, clean tech is going to reach an exponential liftoff anytime soon. And there's what I like to think of as clean tech 1.0 and clean tech 2.0. The top line there is clean tech 1.0. You know all about this, I'm sure. Renewables are still falling in price by the end of this decade. My guess is that at the margin, renewables will cost something like 20% of the cost of producing energy from a gas turbine. But renewables are intermittent and you need a lot of infrastructure to go with them to stabilize the grid. The next picture on the top line is a picture of a grid scale battery. These have been on grids now for 3 or 4 years. The cost of electricity that is produced by renewables and goes into and out of a grid scale battery is about twice the cost of gas generation, but by the end of this decade, it'll be down at the level of gas generation. Hydrogen is the new up and comer. A huge amount is being done to develop a hydrogen economy. I've put a box on the right of the sort of things that are being developed at the moment. The reason that hydrogen is important is for the countries in the north where the wind doesn't blow and the sun doesn't shine during the winter, maybe for weeks at a time. If you want a renewable, if you want a grid powered by renewables, you have to be able to back up the grid for a month or two. You can do it with hydrogen. If you produce hydrogen, you can store hydrogen down in salt mines and or in salt cavities, and you can then generate electricity from the hydrogen using a gas turbine. So it's a store of energy and it's a transmitter of energy. The problem with hydrogen is it's very expensive to produce. At the moment, generating electricity from hydrogen produced from renewables is 3 or 4 times the cost of generating electricity using a gas turbine. My guess is that within 10 or 15 years, hydrogen will be competitive, though, simply because of the huge effort being to develop it. The last component of the grid is a smart grid. You need to match supply with intermittent supply with demand. Smart algorithms are certainly part, AI algorithms are a big part of that. Also, if ideally continent scale grids, so you can link places where the sun is shining to those where it's not. The reason why renewables are taking longer than you might expect to be rolled out is, I think, twofold. Firstly, of course, there's huge opposition from the fossil fuel companies to try and stop it, but there's also the complexity and cost of the grid you need to make intermittent renewables produce energy reliably. My last picture on that top line is a Rivian pickup truck. I like the Rivian pickup truck because Rivian was IPO'd in the autumn of last year for a market value of $100 billion, having made only 1,000 vehicles in its entire life. I think that's fabulous. And it shows you just how fast the market is expecting electric vehicles to take off. So that's Cleantech 1.0. Cleantech 2.0 is in the lower row, and we'll start with the Wagyu beef steak on the bottom left. That's a Wagyu beef steak that has never seen a cow's backside. It was digitally printed by the printer you see above it. The printer doesn't contain ink, of course. It contains protein cells and fat cells and blood cells. The steak is genetically indistinguishable from one of its four-legged beef-produced steaks. This could be synthetic meat. This technology, synthetic meat, could be the most important technology on here, given that renewables are now well developed. And the reason I say that is because if you could replace four-legged meat by synthetic meat right throughout the $1 trillion meat market, you would do two things. You would reduce global carbon emissions by about 20 or 30%. That's the level of emissions coming from meat agriculture, and you would free up a huge amount of pasture land for rewilding or being looked after in one way or another, and that would enable huge amounts of carbon to be drawn down from the atmosphere. If I had one wish, it would be to switch on synthetic meat right across the economy today. That would solve climate change. It would stop the geological transition where it is now. It's not just meat. The whole of the food chain could become synthetic, with a few exceptions. The next picture is artificial flour. It's a protein-based flour made by a bug in a vat that likes to eat hydrogen and carbon dioxide. The pancake made from it was apparently delicious. There's no reason why you couldn't replace field-grown flour with synthetic flour over the next decade or two. And then lastly, just to complete the breakfast picture, a cup of coffee. The coffee was made from coffee cells, again, grown in a vat. The advantage of making coffee that way is you don't need to chop down rainforests to create coffee plantations, as well as the ability to rapidly address the geological transition by changing the food system. There is another need for doing this, which is that as the climate becomes more and more unstable, there will be a need to produce food in ways that don't depend on historical weather patterns. So synthetic food could well be a way of for humanity to fight its way through the geological transition. Next two technologies, the first one there is carbon disposal. Those are the picture shows fans, they suck in air, the air is bubbled through a solvent, the solvent absorbs carbon dioxide. When the solvent is saturated, you heat it up, you get pure carbon dioxide out. You can then bury the carbon dioxide in a hole in the ground. One particular hole in the ground is in Iceland, which is built on basalt. When carbon dioxide is pumped into basalt, it turns itself into calcium carbonate, it turns itself into a rock, which is completely stable. The cost of putting it down, of transporting it and putting it down in a hole is about $10 a ton. It's tiny. The problem with carbon disposal is not the disposal, it's capturing it. If you try and capture carbon from a flue gas at a power station, it costs about $40 or $50 a ton to capture. So the complete process of capture and disposal is a $60 process, something like that. That compares with the EU carbon price of about $100. It's economically feasible now. The price of sucking it out of the air, as in the picture, is about $600 per ton. So it's nowhere near economic. But as that price comes down, as the technology improves, and as the carbon price goes up, my guess is that sometime in the mid-2030s, carbon disposal will become a $1 trillion industry. The last thing I want to talk about is new materials, and I've illustrated this with a couple of talcum powder boxes. They're made from plastic, but the plastic is not made from oil. It's based from wood. It's made from wood fiber. It's biodegradable. You can compost those plastic boxes. And they signify a huge development in the creation of new material and molecules, which has been enabled by AI. If you want to create a material or a molecule with specific properties, you can now say what those properties are and ask an AI algorithm to design the molecule. Another algorithm will create a recipe for creating that molecule. And there are robotic synthesizers. Now you feed them the recipe and they will synthesize a sample of the molecule. Coming soon in a few years is quantum simulation. You won't even need to synthesize the molecule to see what it does. You will be able to simulate it. My guess is that the time for creating new materials will go down from 12 months to a couple of weeks once this technology comes online. So there's a huge amount happening there and a huge amount to hope for trying to stop the geological transition in its tracks. So what will happen over the next 15 years? Well, this will happen. I think this is almost certain. Coal will go, methane will go, petrol cars will go, oil-based plastics will go. What happens to the oil price depends on what oil producers do. If they match their investment to falling demand as they see it fall, then the oil price will stay high. If they overproduce, then the oil price will go low. I mean, it will almost certainly be very volatile. As demand falls and as prices fluctuate, the petrostates are going to be stressed. As the food system is reworked with synthetic food, ranching will become a thing of the past, and the industrial scale agribusiness will be transformed. That's something like that will happen over the next couple of decades. Clean tech's value will also surge. I've given you I wanted to give you a sense of where the clean tech companies are and what their values are. The light blue companies are US, the pink companies are Chinese, the yellow companies are European, and the dark blue companies are Far East or Middle East. You can see that wind turbines are a European and Chinese market, solar panels are Chinese, batteries are Far East and Chinese, really, apart from what Tesla is doing, and electric vehicles are US and China. Of course, all the traditional manufacturers are starting up electric vehicle operations, and we'll see how they compare with the new people on the block. And then moving across the diagram, hydrogen, clean meat, carbon disposal. At the moment, these are US and European businesses, but China will come in strongly as they start growing. I put quantum computing on here because of the simulation of new materials. It's very encouraging to see quantum computing startups with values up at the billion dollar level. And I've also put a column there for nuclear. Modular nuclear is coming quite quickly. And on a slightly more distant horizon, nuclear fusion, which would be completely transformative if it could be done economically, is also on its way. But then there's the last column. I've compared these values with the values with 3 large oil companies. And as you can see, the 3 large oil companies dwarf all the other clean tech companies other than Tesla. And that just tells you that although the market sees clean tech taking off, it's a long, long way from taking over from the fossil fuel companies. And the last diagram, the diagram at the bottom there is China's energy mix, just so you see what China is planning. It's going to go from coal, nearly all coal now, to a mixture of wind, nuclear, and solar by 2060, a perfectly sensible transition. It will make this transition. It will go at its own speed. I've made a note there that China employs something like 2.5 million people in its coal industry, all concentrated in one province as it happens. So it's not only got big engineering problems in doing this, it's got large social issues as well. So where does that leave us? Well, this is where it leaves us. The early Anthropocene is going to be tough. We've got what I've called an anarchic, chaotic super transition underway. And the elements of that super transition are climate change, nature destruction, energy transition, a food transition, transport transition, new materials, large migration, potentially population falling if fertilization is impaired, deep disruption of economic growth, quite possible, the rise of China, and AI algorithms. I've called it an anarchic because no one's in charge now that the US is withdrawing from global leadership. I've called it chaotic because small changes in what is done now could lead to huge differences in eventual outcomes. This transition is slow in news cycle time. You will see events on the news, floods and AI algorithms and all these things one at a time. But in fact, it's part of a continuous process which is almost instantaneous in geological time. The COPs, the Conference of Parties for Climate and for the Environment, can cajole and encourage, but they can't prescribe. And that's why not enough is happening to slow down this transition, the geological transition. It seems to me that it is almost unavoidable that we're going to end up in a world that is 2 degrees centigrade or more warmer, that is dangerous and degraded. But we just have to take that. I mean, while we should do everything we can to slow down the geological transition, it does seem to me that if you draw a probability chart, right in the middle is that kind of outcome. Systemic risk will increase, resilience of countries and companies will be valued, long-term economic growth and social stability can no longer be assumed. And in the near future, the US may fracture politically and socially. What is likely, a multi-decadal digital and clean tech investment boom, exponentially fast innovation and scaling up. The innovation has to be rolled out quickly and there'll be a lot of pressure to do that. Multiple transitions in energy, food, transport materials, multiple disruptions, energy, food, supply chain, infrastructure, and eventually a property bust as people realize that living on the coast and near forests is just not what you want to do as the weather changes. If I were on a board, I would worry about this huge rate of change, the decision to be resilient versus to maximize the return on capital and what my shareholders thought about that. How I responded to consumer pressure. There'll be a huge amount of pressure for companies to respond to what's going on. And that pressure will sometimes be realized or expressed through litigation. So I think directors must watch out for litigation on climate and nature subjects. Irrespective if I were on a board or in a company, if I stood back from all of this and just looked at it as a human being, I would want to do, and I would want my company to do, everything that is reasonably in its power to help slow down the geological transition, and I wouldn't be content unless it did so. So on that note, let me thank you for your attention.
Howard, thank you very much. I did say in the beginning this would be rather challenging, didn't I? And there's no doubt that you have made us all quake in our boots a little bit, but you've also seeded some optimism. There are a huge number of questions, as you would expect. I thought we might start with the map, geopolitics. Howard, you talked about the withdrawal of the US and the China first policy being pursued. I think you didn't talk about the Belt and Road countries, but it certainly seemed to span a huge amount of the open space, let's say, in the political map. I was just wondering, just reflecting on one or two of the questions here, COPs clearly are not sufficient, Howard, the US withdrawing. Do you think there's a chance that China, India, the US might actually come together and accelerate the change required in everyone's interest? I'd probably add Australia to that as well, given its exports of fossil fuels. Do you think there is a chance? As we saw towards the end of COP, there was a glimmer of hope as China and the US came together to stitch at least some wording together. It wasn't quite desirable, but at least some wording. What's your take on geopolitics? And actually, doesn't mankind really need to do that to make a big difference quite quickly?
So, I mean, I think a lot of this revolves around the US and China. I think that China finds the US incomprehensible at the moment. It just doesn't understand I mean, you can see what's going on in the US, but it doesn't understand deep down how what's going on in the US can be allowed to go on, if I can put it that way. The Chinese leadership are very intelligent and very versed in what is going on. They go through an intense selection process over 20 or 30 years of their career before they get to the top. So they really are very capable within, of course, the Communist Party system. They understand all of this climate stuff easily. The Chinese people, however, don't understand it. They understand air pollution and they understand pollution of rivers, but they don't understand the bigger picture. So the Chinese leadership have a problem of wanting to implement changes and create what Xi has called an ecological civilization, but they are not yet in a position to take the people with them. They have to keep economic growth going. They have to keep the lights switched on. When they look at America, they see a dysfunctional mess. They don't want to become dysfunctional. And they see not only the US being dysfunctional, but they see the US being hostile. Of course, the US, the other way around, sees China being hostile. I don't see any possibility in the immediate future for that kind of deep cooperation between the US and China needed to deal with this problem. I mean, who would China be cooperating with? If it cooperated with Biden, it might have Trump in another 2 or 3 years. The US is just too unstable now, and the world recognizes that the US make more progress with the EU. I think there's a lot more scope for the EU and China to cooperate. But the reason I spend a lot of time talking about technology is because the thing that will drive all countries is the technology. If the entrepreneurs and the scientists and the engineers can get the costs of rival technologies down, they will penetrate the various markets irrespective of the difficulty in the politics. So it's technology I'm putting my hope on.
I think we could sense your enthusiasm there, Howard. And there are a number of questions that you might sort of say are hinting that even your vision of tech might be somewhat limited, Howard. Won't we be inventing new AI, for example, that might counter the effect of the dangerous AI that you talked about? So, I mean, you know, we can't sort of predict what new tech, what new we're going to be inventing over the next sort of 10 years with a degree of certainty. Now, obviously, your connections in the scientific world mean that you have much greater visibility than most of us on this call. But the rate of innovation and the rate of development is happening at massive pace, isn't it? Aided, as you said, quite rightly pointed out, by AI tools and so on. So I suppose the question was really deeply rooted in, is it right to be as gloomy, or should we be more optimistic that mankind will invent the sorts of technologies and deploy them at a faster rate than you might be predicting?
Okay, so there are two issues there. There's the AI issue, and there is the geological transition issue. So the geological transition is all about physical things happening. It's all about carbon dioxide being pumped up and rainforests being obliterated. And it's very hard to see how new AI technologies or digital technologies are going to have a significant impact on that. Clean technology, clean energy technologies could, and clean food technologies, synthetic food, could have an impact on that. And AI could help with both of those technologies, but AI will not be front and center of those technologies. On AI itself, I mean, the recent BBC Reef lectures were all about the potential dangers posed by AI and how you might deal with them. So I mention that because a huge amount of work is being done by AI professionals and AI philosophers to try and solve this problem of avoiding misaligned AI. I think the community, the AI community, is reasonably optimistic that we can avoid it, but by no means certain. That's why the probability of disruption from misaligned AI is 1 in 10 rather than 1 in 2. But I don't think anyone would say it's as low as 1 in 100.
Howard, can we move to carbon reduction and the impact here? As you say, this is going to be a huge part of the geological transition. The COPs are not very successful. The issue seems to be a mixture of political leadership. I was interested to see a survey of institutional investors who said they wouldn't accept any marginal reduction in returns on investment for the climate transition. I expect you saw that and were quite surprised by this lack of alignment, but possibly deeply not very surprised as well. Could you just say a few words around political leadership, this system of re-election, the role of business leaders in this sort of what needs to be not only a national but a global conversation about this transition? And what would you encourage, how do we elevate this, and what do you encourage business leaders to do? You made a statement that COPs are not successful, and I'm not sure I would agree with that. Given the constraint on COPs, given the geopolitics, I think COPs do about as good a job as they could do. They haven't solved the problem, of course. Emissions are still going up, but one has to admire the people who put in such immense time and effort in trying
to get the parties with completely different views together around a table. And in setting targets, in setting standards, COPs have told the world where things are headed. They have told the world that emissions are going to come down, and that has enabled investors and technologists to develop technologies which will help satisfy that. So because we're humans, that isn't a perfect solution. In fact, it's nowhere near perfect, but it is the best we can do. Now, I mean, I've been talking to investors for goodness knows how many years, and I like to make the joke that a long time for an investor is a day, and an eternity is a week. I mean, it does work something like that. If your quarterly returns are not where your competitors are, you have a problem, which is why I certainly understand how people focused on investment returns would say what they say about not accepting a dilution of those returns because of investment to stop climate change. The fact of the matter is they are building up the risk of deep global disruption, which will obliterate returns entirely if we get to that point. They are paid to behave the way they do. All the incentives are for quarterly returns. There are not incentives for avoiding the possibility of global disruption 40 years away or whatever it is. I think that business, I mean, we are humans, we live in a human society. You can only lead and push society as far as it is willing to be led and pushed. I do think that the business leaders who do have the time to reflect on these matters and see the changes that are coming, I think they do have an enormous obligation to do what they can to slow down the geological transition by reducing emissions and protecting nature where they can, given their constraints. And I think it's appalling that business leaders choose greenwashing rather than doing the ethical thing.
So how that brings us neatly to a point about carbon credits and the market and what you want to see to sort of make businesses do something that's, if you like, more effective in the very short term, as they're being encouraged to do. What would you be encouraging business leaders to do to offset the carbon that they produce? Obviously, they need to reduce it as much as possible through their own processes, but there will be residual offsets required. What is the best way to go about that, in your view?
I don't believe in any offsets other than burying the stuff in a hole in the ground. So if business leaders can't reduce their carbon emissions, they should capture them and bury them. So that means putting carbon capture on their smokestacks and getting the stuff buried, or it means paying some other factory to have some capturing mechanism and bury the equivalent amount of carbon dioxide, or it means promoting direct air capture. These are expensive. The cheaper options, I do not believe, stand up to scrutiny. You can say let's all merrily grow trees, and that's fine. But if there are well documented enormous problems with growing trees. I mean, the least of them is that you have to protect a forest for the next century or longer, and then bury the carbon when the forest begins to die. I mean, the bigger problem is that there are schemes wiping out rainforests to grow carbon offset forests. I mean, these have to be handled with immense care, and I don't think people are handling them with care at all.
Yes, so investing in carbon capture and storage is by far the best way. and
burying the stuff.
Burying the stuff. Many people have said we've produced enough, the damage is done, so actually we have to retire from now on, rather than producing more and thinking that we can offset it. So I think you're aligned with very many other scientists in that area. Howard, can we go to food production for a minute? A question around the market value. I can see this is probably a question from an anonymous entrepreneur, but a question around market value. Why was meat valued so very highly? And of course, there are two companies that you put on your unicorn list, let's say, of new tech. Why were meat companies valued so highly and versus flour and coffee? And now there's a market value, but there's also a value to the planet, perhaps.
Okay. So those values that I put on the little pictures of the steak and the flour and the coffee, those were total market sizes, current market sizes. So the $1 billion, the meat market is $1 billion per annum market, and the flour market is a $300 million value market. So those aren't values of companies; they are their values of annual sales in those markets. So in the meat market, there's $1 billion market to go for. It's a huge market. So entrepreneurs should be piling in.
Very good. Thank you very much. Howard, I think we're going to try to let you go in a few minutes. I thought there was one excellent question that we might end on, and that is, Howard, if you painted yourself as the savior of the world, what are the top 3 actions that you would undertake right now? Money and politics, no option. No, do not interfere.
I would mandate that by 2030, all carbon emissions had to stop or be captured and buried. I would mandate that by 2035, all non-synthetic meat production, other than what one might call rustic ideals of a few cows per farm, but all meat production had to switch to synthetic. And I mandate that, again, on the same time scale, probably 2030 actually, that by 2030, all products derived from plantations that replaced rainforests had to be withdrawn from consumer foods and replaced with synthetic products. So there we are. I would redo, mandate total carbon capture and get rid of all the harmful things in the food chain all at one go.
I think that's fantastic, and I think it means that market forces are changed by the power of interference and regulation.
Exactly.
And we need to call for some of those at the time scale that you're talking about, rather than wander into a scenario that you've painted today. Howard, on behalf of all of us, thank you so much for joining us. We promised an unsettling tour de force. I think you've very much delivered that. And we very much hope that you may join us again a year from now to share how we're doing against the journey that you've painted, Howard. On behalf of all of us, thank you so much for joining us for a fascinating discussion today. And
thank you very
to our
much.
audience, thank you, and we look forward to seeing you again soon at the Deloitte Academy.